Hey everybody, welcome back for another video. Today we're going to be talking about the curious case of Parliament Hill, and we're going to be looking at the center block, this Parliament building, and it's in Ottawa, Ontario, and there's something really unusual about this site that we're going to dig into. Should be interesting. Let's get into it. Now, there has been a massive renovation project on the center block, and it's expected that they're going to wrap up the renovations by 2031, so quite a bit away, but the total bill is going to rack up to about $5 billion. So just, more money well spent. But during the renovations, they uncovered, what we're told anyway, are the lost foundations to the previous Parliament building and the previous tower, which was called the Victoria Tower. So they uncovered these foundations that they're being referred to as. Why this is so interesting to me is because as you look at this image of the original Parliament building, this is what it looked like, and both buildings looked fairly similar actually. They were both in the Gothic Revival architectural style. So slight differences, but this building, we're told, was built between 1859 and 1876, and there are actually a lot of photos that may be accurate, but they show the construction. And then there was a fire that happened in 1916, and I believe there's even a video showing a structure burning, and I'll try to overlay that on this video. But there's a lot of photos, there's a lot of somewhat compelling evidence to indicate that this previous building existed. And then shortly after this fire destroyed this building, they built the structure you see today. So what's unusual is you rarely have instances where there are two of these old world buildings on one site with the supporting photographic evidence potentially and video evidence. And to top it off, there's traces of an earlier colonial period activity on Parliament Hill as well. So you have all three of these phases, but there's almost always only two phases: the early colonial period and one old world building. Here we're having the early colonial period and two old world buildings. So that's what's being claimed anyway. So here's just another image of the remnants of the previous Parliament building, and they decided that because of all the fire damage, they had to pull everything down. And this is an image of the old Parliament building as well before the fire. So they pulled all the walls down, just left that foundation and then built on top of it. And there's even newspaper articles from several different newspapers. This is the Ottawa Evening Journal from February of 1916 and the Ottawa Citizen, once again, the same month of 1916. So it seems like there's a lot of evidence pointing to that this previous Parliament building existed, and then they built a new Parliament building, which we see today. But the pattern that I've been looking at, and we're going to go into it, the pattern usually only shows an early colonial period, at least in North America, an early colonial period that's usually buried and traces of maybe a fire, great fire, and then you have the old world building sitting on top, but you never get two old world buildings. So this stands out. And the only thing we're told that survived that great fire of 1916, which again, that fire, it remains a mystery as to what caused that fire. But the only thing that survived is this really interesting library, the Library of Parliament. And there are images of the construction of this, apparently with guys hanging out on the top of this dome here. But what I find interesting about this library is that we're told it was inspired by the medieval chapter house. So chapter houses, they can be found in greater numbers in Europe, and they're usually attached to like monasteries or cathedrals, abbeys. And just for reference here, on the right I'm showing an image of one of these chapter houses that's connected to Lincoln Cathedral in England, and the time frames for the construction of this particular chapter house, it goes all the way up to 1300, and we have this one in Ottawa, which we're told was built in the 1860s and 70s. So very similar, the use of these flying buttresses And I think this was 8-sided, octagonal, and there's plenty of 8 10-sided chapter houses. I think this one's 10-sided, the one associated with Lincoln Cathedral. Just really interesting that you have this design style which seems to line up with structures that are much older. So I just wanted to point that out. But just to recap, what is this pattern? I talk about it all the time. When you look at, especially in North America, you look at a lot of these cities like New Orleans, and you're looking at the French Quarter, which of course used to be this French colonial site, and they had defensive fortifications, and all of this fortifications, we're told, were intentionally destroyed. There was, I think, 2 great fires in the late 1700s, and I believe most of the French Quarter, the colonial French Quarter, is buried 4 to 6 feet. And what got built after this colonial period, once again, are a lot of times these neoclassical buildings. And I think that there was some event, and I think a lot of these buildings are a bit older than they're telling us, the neoclassical ones. So that's the pattern. I think they're trying to hide that from us. And like I said, you could go to Charleston. I talk about Charleston all the time, but apparently it was once a walled city, an English settlement, and it was a fortified city. And I came across this article, the old city wall of Charleston remained buried and forgotten until traces of the Granville Bastion were discovered in the 1920s. And portions of this wall are 8 feet high, and they're all buried. So we're told everybody just helped pitch in. They intentionally buried the city, and they built on top of it. So I think what happened was this event that is causing this. And you can even go to Melbourne, Australia, look at their early colonial period, and you find these buried blocks, the Melbourne buried blocks, the phenomenon that wasn't discovered until 2017. And people completely forgot. Apparently, the street levels were raised, but people forgot about it. So that's a huge, in my opinion, a huge lie and deception, and roughly from the 1860s. So they're able to deceive us on a massive scale from a time period as little as 160 years ago. Yeah, they found this fence that was largely undamaged in the 1920s. Before they uncovered all these other buried blocks, they stumbled upon this buried fence, which seems to be largely intact. And I think a lot of this fill is yellow clay. But once again, this early colonial period, buried, forgotten about. I think it was because of an event. And in Melbourne, once again, a lot of neoclassical buildings get built. So when I look at Parliament Hill with those 2 Parliament buildings, I can also find during excavations at Parliament Hill, they also found traces of this early colonial period. And we're told, I think they found like a barracks, they found a jail, and I think stables, but we're told those structures were intentionally demolished as construction began for that first Parliament building. So once again, we're seeing this early colonial period demolished. Now we're told here it was intentional. Fair enough, but usually what comes after this is just one structure, one old world structure, but we have 2. So that's why I'm thinking the first one may never have existed, even though that seems like a large lie to pull off, considering how important these buildings are. But it's just this pattern that I observe, and I think I've talked about this in some other videos. Here's the center block, that Parliament building. Here's that library. This is the Rideau Canal. Just across that canal is this park, Majors Hill Park. And there was the remnants of this Lieutenant Colonel John By, who apparently he oversaw the construction project of this canal, but this is supposed to be his residence, and wouldn't you know it, it looks like it's been demolished. And there were excavations in 1973, tons of artifacts found, and of course we're told it was destroyed once again by a massive fire in 1849. So even around Parliament Hill, where this building is, I'm seeing these early colonial period, partially buried, destroyed, but we're given different narratives, in my opinion. And even if we go, here's the Parliament building once again, the central building, the center block. If we go about a mile outside of it in the other direction, there's an area called Le Breton Flats, roughly a mile away or so. There's been archaeological excavations in this area, and they have been finding artifacts related to, once again, this 1800s period. The settlement was called Bytown, named after that lieutenant colonel. So they're finding all these buried artifacts. I believe there also was a great fire this time in 1900 that ripped through this area as well as Hull in Quebec. So once again, on both sides of that Parliament Hill, you have remnants of this early colonial period, traces of a fire, all this stuff's buried, sub-levels, and then usually what happens is there's only one building, but there's two on Parliament Hill, and they're both in this Gothic Revival style. So that's what makes me think one of them didn't exist, and since we can observe one, that's what makes me think the first one never existed, even though there's a ton of evidence for it. Like, there's a ton of photographic evidence, there's newspaper articles, but maybe this is the exception. What else I wanted to mention is this is a construction photo for the more recent Parliament building, the central one, center block. And they mention how some of the stone came from this forest quarry. So I wanted to kind of look into that. Turns out that some of the stone that was used for the center block, as well as the two other Parliament buildings, they said the stone was called Nepean sandstone, and it came from the township of Nepean in Ottawa. So they referenced this deserted quarry, so I wanted to look into it. And I came across more articles talking about this forgotten, overgrown quarry provided the building blocks of Ottawa. And there's a bunch of trails in this particular area, and just off the trails there are all these cut stones strewn about. And apparently this site was in operation until 1962, when it was expropriated by this commission, the NCC, where it remains forgotten and overgrown. So all this stuff is unmarked, just like lying just off the beaten path, all these nature trails. And just looking into the narrative, this site, roughly where it's located, it's about 9 or so miles away from Parliament Hill. So apparently stone was hauled up to the building site by teams of horses, again 1916, 17, 18, that range. But these teams of horses struggling along poor roads with 6-ton loads. Each team could make but one trip to the site per day. So maybe, but again, just wanted to kind of look into that a little bit. And they mentioned that this stone was used with regards to some of these other structures in Ottawa, like the Dominion Observatory. And some of you may have seen some images for this particular building, but I guess it was using this type of sandstone, Nepean sandstone. And when you go to the back of this structure, there's a lot of interesting issues with regards to the grade and structures in and around this building. There are, once again, construction photos for this structure as well, we're told. But I just wanted to look at this particular one showing the dome. Once again, dudes on domes here. But when you just look at the light source associated with these three individuals, no caution. Okay, this gentleman is fairly lit up. You know, there's apparently daytime. The light source seems to be consistent, but then when you get to this gentleman, again, you just can't make out anything with regards to his face, but he's wearing a hat, so some of that checks out. You know, you'd think the top of the hat would be a bit brighter, but maybe it's a black hat, who knows. But then you get to this guy, and again, just completely blacked out with the exception of his hands, and I guess he could be wearing a black suit, but I don't know. You guys can weigh in on this. Does that look natural, or does that look legit even? I guess I just have my speculations, but I wanted just to point out this particular image here. So I think that's about it for today. But the Parliament building is an interesting case, the center block, because clearly there was something that pre-existed the current structure that we see. But was this part of that first Parliament building that we see in all the images and even in the video of the structure burning? Are we actually being told the truth for once, or is this an elaborate deception? It doesn't fit the pattern that I'm used to seeing, and it'd be easy for me just to say, well, the first Parliament building's a fake, but it's just so recent, you know, like, and there's a ton of images, and I understand I know images are faked, and even videos can be faked. Like, I've seen it. So it's just so recent that I have to be a bit cautious when I'm looking at this. But what do you guys think? Is the first Parliament building legit, thereby the second one's legit? Is this a case where the narrative is on point? And is this something maybe we just got to rethink? Or what's your opinion anyway? So I think I'll leave it here, but I do want to give a big shout out to my channel members. Thank you for all your help and support. Really appreciate you guys. And also wanted to give a shout out to my patrons. Really appreciate your help and support as well. Thanks for everything that you do. So I think that's it for today, but until next time, take care.